Okay, so from me to get today, you get two for the price of one. I think whether you want it or not, I'm going to talk about both the K Bart best practice and the DDA emerging best practice. So K Bart is about to release its phase 2, and the DDA best practice is not yet released its phase 1. That's due in December. So what is K Bart? A cartoon character? No, not anything to do with that. Bay Area Rapid Transit is very appropriate for here. No, it's not. That's not the Bart. K Bart is knowledge bases and related tools. And so I'll just give you a kind of an overview of some of the aspects and then talk to you about the things that I think probably matter most to you. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I'm hoping to pique your interest and get you interested in considering endorsing or adopting these best standards or best practices. So this is, as usual, it's a group of publishers, aggregators, knowledge base vendors, libraries. Everyone's getting together to decide how to create or what a universally acceptable holdings data format would look like. It started with journals. It's moving into books. But the purpose is really to make sure that users have better access to your content through more accurate or more transferable holdings data. So it's effective throughout the supply chain. I'll show you a little bit of that in a second. And as I mentioned, the phase 1 report was a while back, and we are getting ready to release the phase 2. So formal definition, it's a set of practical recommendations for the timely exchange of accurate metadata between content providers and knowledge base developers. The key thing here is it doesn't have many, or in fact maybe any, things that aren't generally shared between these partners, but it is a way, a syntax and a format for exchanging those data so that they're easily accessible by different companies who need to, or players, stakeholders who need to have access to the data. So that single solution for sharing holdings data is the key part. So where does it apply? Really all throughout the chain. Of course, the publishers are producing the content, and it has to go all the way through the supply chain, through the content host, into databases and gateways, into our knowledge bases, and then, of course, our users access our knowledge bases in various ways. But having that data be available to users, at least as it depends on library-based usage, is really dependent on accurate data in that knowledge base. So it supports, the goal is to support maintenance of accurate data. So we have data in our knowledge bases which is more or less accurate, but it changes rapidly. And to be able to constantly upload and correct that data, if you have to translate it every time you get it from every different partner you get it from as a knowledge base provider or as a library, you're not going to be able to keep up. And so this, using this syntax and format does support open URL link resolvers, which then in turn tend to support eJournal and eBookmark record delivery and automated updating by knowledge base providers. So it addresses or attempts to address at least some common holding list inadequacies, reuse of ISSNs on titles that have changed, embargo period ambiguities, inconsistent date and enumeration formats. All those things can be really hard to fix when you're trying to bring the data in. And so it says, this is the way we think this is best done. Please do it this way. So what's the benefit to publishers? What's in it for you? This is just really rough estimates, but some work that I did and that's supported by work of others say that OpenURL fails about 30% of the time. So user trying to get from a reference in a database to the full text content through this linking system isn't able to get there 3 out of 10 times. So if roughly 50% of the traffic to your content comes from Google Scholar and other knowledge-based dependent library tools, the rest might come from Google and other places which are just going to go directly from their indexing, then potentially, given that 30% failure, we could see as much as a 15% increase in traffic with this accurate, easily transferable, timely metadata available to libraries. And of course, there's also the satisfied customer piece. We have done some survey data, and there is some survey data coming out in the Phase 2 report that shows that both consortia and libraries really feel this is important. So it's a relatively simple metadata exchange format. This is a list of most, well, getting close to most of the fields. We're going to be adding a few in Phase 2. But it's not rocket science. It's really just the kinds of things that we pass on anyway, but codifying a way to do that so that it's easier to do. There's a clearinghouse now, and I encourage you to go check this out. This is the K Bart registry. It is a place where folks who are either on their way to endorsing and adopting K Bart as a best practice or are interested in it can register. And there also are included here, as you see down here, URL to metadata. It is a repository of access lists for lots of different publishers. So this is becoming a place where librarians and link resolver providers can go to get this data directly from the publishers in the format that is useful to them. So here's an example from Cambridge, one of the publishers that has endorsed it, and its various different versions, all of which are K Bart formatted of different collections of content. So the steps to adopt K Bart best practices are pretty simple. Review the requirements, format your data in that way, self-check your data sets to make sure that they are matching that recommended practice. Send them off to the working group. The working group sends us to the knowledge base providers who review it, say, yep, this looks good, or nope, there's a couple things they need to fix. We let you know, and then we add you to the registry, and you become an endorser. And that's great for us because we certainly want as many folks to participate as possible. So here's the new part, if you already knew about K Bart. Phase 2 will be out this summer, and it will replace the Phase 1 best practices with additions that accommodate kind of 3 or 4 new areas. Ebooks were more or less covered before, but not exhaustively and effectively, so we've added some fields for ebooks, editor, volume edition, date published, and I have an asterisk there, so if I get a chance during questions, I might ask you whether you think we should be having both a print date published and an online date published. There's some disagreement in the group about whether those are useful differentiations and whether that data would be meaningful and whether you have it or not. Series including conference proceedings, so we've allowed for and tried to be able to work with conference proceedings and print monograph series to allow individual entries for books to also have parent IDs and to be associated with an ISSN or a series as well as being an individually listed item. Consortia files, this is really an effort to say, if we name these files appropriately, it can really help those who are trying to use them to figure out whether this is a file that's generally applicable in a whole country or to a particular consortium or if it's something more specialized. And then the fourth piece is, so open access metadata, and I think maybe this will create some interesting conversation with Greg's presentation later. So we're adding a new access type field, asking publishers to indicate either fee-based, open access, or hybrid OA. And we are going to basically replace the Phase 1 recommendation with the Phase 2 recommendation. It doesn't extend it very far, but it will contain everything that's in Phase 1. So those that are in Phase 1 are going to ask to resubmit test files, and those who have not yet endorsed and adopted these best practices will be asked to go straight into the Phase 2 version. So some of the obstacles here, data quality is, parts of it are easily verified. We can look at the structure of the syntax and see that pretty easily by looking at a few lines of data. Verifying that front file and back file data are separate when they need to be, or that transferred, split, and ceased titles have been treated appropriately as opposed to reusing ISSNs, that's a lot harder thing to test. So we're still working to do a better job of that. Adoption by a few major journal publishers. We've been really pleased with the growth. I think we've more or less tripled it in the last year or two in terms of participation from publishers, which is great. But there's still a few of the major ones which we'd really like to get on board, and I think that just takes continued efforts. And then for me, I have, my interest in K Bart has waned to some degree, I'll be honest about that, because of the challenge of creating generic lists that cover what individual libraries have access to. Technologically, in this day and age, I think we should be able to say, I'm at this IP address in this library, send me what I have access to, create the list on the fly that's what's appropriate to me, and not worry about having to maintain all these separate lists. And there are lots of tools out there that are beginning to try to be listless, not listless negatively, but not depending on lists. And I'd love to see some of those succeed. We're not there yet. Probably maybe are a ways from that. But the challenge of creating generic lists, it's always going to be hard. It's never going to be perfect. And it is a big challenge. Okay, so I am going to zoom into the other half because I'm about halfway through my time. So more recently, both the group and I have joined the NISO Demand-Driven Acquisition of Monographs Recommended Practices Group. It was founded just a few months ago. One thing I want to present to you as a take-home, and I don't have time to go into the intricacies or even the overview of demand-driven and patron-driven acquisitions today. This video, though, at bit.ly ebas capital PDA, is an outstanding 10-minute overview of patron-driven acquisition in cartoon form. It's entertaining, really well done by a consortium in the UK, just describing the various ways that it can happen. I think this, if your company is interested in understanding patron-driven acquisitions better, this is a great step in that direction, so I highly recommend it. We on the group have called this demand-driven acquisition rather than the more common patron-driven acquisition because of the concept that patron-driven acquisition is a broader term. It can really include indirect patron input, it can include faculty requests, various other kinds of things that might mean what we're acquiring is driven by patrons. Demand-driven is separated out from that, or is a more specific part of that by saying it really is an acquisitions at the point of need, so taking acquisition from possible use to filling an immediate need. So why do we need them? Libraries are having to manage a consideration pool, the titles available for purchase or lease through demand-driven acquisition. And that's really complex because the size of the pool affects how many books you buy and how much money you spend, and the question of how long it should be, how long you should keep them in there, and what the size should be, and how to manage what's in and what's out, and how to change that. That's a question not easily answered and not probably best managed by guessing. So we are doing our best to talk to those who have had the most experience in this to create recommendations for adding titles, for keeping unowned titles available, removing titles, managing records, dealing with the whole process of making books available for demand-driven acquisition. And the goals overall of the group are to create a flexible but consistent model for demand-driven acquisition that works for all the partners involved. So ideally, we'd be able to support creation of plans at libraries that meet local budget and collection needs, support implementation in more than one aggregator because all the content is not available on any given aggregator. If you want to have a comprehensive demand-driven collection, you really have to use more than one. And to account for how demand-driven acquisition affects all parts of libraries, and to allow for consortial participation, which is also a bit sticky. So, one piece, there's sort of three major pieces that I'll sort of give you an overview of now. The first is access models related. So, developing consistent models for the free discovery period that happens before patron-driven acquisition, for the temporary lease period, which is usually an indication of interest which leads toward purchase eventually, and then finally when that purchase happens, how it happens. So to have that be a little more consistent and make sure that those are as robust as possible to things like discovery tools and other things that can create use that looks as if it's meaningful but might not be, right? If you want to acquire something based on usage, you only want to do that based on usage that's actually meaningful. And so having some standard ways of defining these periods should be helpful in that. Second part is related to more technical issues, managing and populating that consideration pool I was talking about, loading and uploading and removing records, and managing multiple formats as well in the midst of the demand-driven acquisition process. The third major area is metrics. So developing tools and strategies to measure use, comparing across aggregators, analyzing local and consortial differences, and enabling predictions of expected spending and future usage. So this is really huge. Libraries, many of them, are concerned about, and there's a lot of lore out there about, well, what happens when you open a collection and all the money disappears in 10 days? What do you do then? So there really are predictable patterns that are emerging from the size of the institution, the type of the institution, the number of records made available, all those sorts of things, and we're trying to bring some of that data together to ideally create kind of a killer app that would allow libraries to say, well, I have this much money to spend, and I'm going to do this for this long, and I'm this size. What are the parameters that I should be thinking of? What ranges should I be working in? And we're also looking to apply analyses of referral sources really to understand where the usage is coming from that is driving this purchasing. So another point that I wanted to mention, and I maybe get to it in the next slide as well, but providing long-term access to unowned ebook content is a question. So if we're moving in demand-driven direction and we're only paying for and buying those things that are used, then what happens when we want to get access to content that didn't happen to be used now but we want to use later? How is that going to happen as part of this process is an important thing for us to think about and make recommendations related to. Also looking at connections to print on demand and managing authenticated access. So it's never a good sign when your obstacle slide has the smallest text, which I realized as I was going through that this did. But actually I think that's partly because this is obstacles both for demand-driven acquisitions as a whole as well as for the group. A lot of demand-driven acquisition thought is driven by kind of inside-the-box print-based expectations for ebooks that come both from libraries and from publishers. I think you can think of examples of this as interlibrary loan, wanting to do interlibrary loan when short-term lease is an alternative that is a very reasonable one, but trying to hold to that ILL model may not be the best approach. Auto purchase approval plans, which I know many print vendors depend upon for predictability, really don't make a lot of sense in the world of ebooks and demand-driven ebooks because you can make everything available, everything that you want to, and then not spend on those books until there's actually interest in using them. So that brings out the access versus ownership dilemma that libraries face. Well, how much money do I want to spend on each? We're all shifting in terms of comfortability about that, but that also is in the midst of DDA. And that perceived unpredictability is unpredictable in terms of an individual institution. I think it's not unpredictable on a broader level, and we want to help enable libraries to see the predictability that's based on a larger set of data. For aggregators, the big obstacle still for ebooks and demand-driven acquisitions is simultaneous use restrictions. Sort of the flip side of that is that for publishers, course-adopted book income, so books that are bought by in the print times would have been bought by a lot of different libraries if you make that available without simultaneous use restrictions, you have one sale instead of 20 or 50 sales. And somehow demand-driven acquisitions needs to address that, but hopefully it doesn't have to be only through saying, well, we're going to guess that this set of books might be course adopted, so we're going to limit the use to a level that then causes our users issues. So variety of platforms is an obstacle for us as a working group, from aggregators to publishers. It's not easy to take the different practices that they're doing, the different technical platforms they're using, and also it's a very different thing to be an aggregator and have a sophisticated system that is built for demand-driven acquisitions, and to be a publisher that is used to hosting journal content, which is a very different, the level of sophistication necessary to do this level of demand-driven acquisition, really hard for publishers to acquire. On that note, though, I will highlight evidence-based selection as a publisher option for getting into demand-driven acquisitions. It's highlighted in that video that I mentioned, and it is still favored by many libraries. It basically opens up a set of content for a period of time, has a library commit to buying some set of content, and then at the end of that period of time, based on the use, they choose which books that they want to own. And that is something that I think publishers can implement now to get into this world. And there are things that I think that demand-driven or that evidence-based selection models can learn from the work that we'll be doing. Okay, so we're going to be doing surveys, focus groups, phone interviews. That's going to be happening over the next 6 to 12 months, and we will be sharing these best practices soon. So basically, I've covered a lot of this. I think at this point, I don't really have a call to action for you on the DDA side, but I want you to know that we're working on this, that it's coming out, that it is becoming more and more popular in libraries, and that there is a NISO best practice group working on coming up with best practices that will help both libraries and you. Thanks.
Well done. Questions?
Yes.
I have a question about K Bart.
Mm-hmm.
I'm completely unfamiliar with. So
Okay.
completely stupid question. We just heard you talk about JATs, a lot of JATs,
Mhm.
and metadata.
Right.
On the third or fourth slide, you showed a whole lot of metadata. Is there any coordination between the two efforts?
Right.
Repeat the question.
Probably part of I think JATS is more focused at the individual article level. I mean, you're describing the content at that lower level. We're mostly, for journals, tracking journals and volumes, which actually is an issue. So I think there could be implications ultimately if JATS was including things, and I don't know if it would, like hybrid OA, fee-based, that sort of thing. I don't know that that would necessarily be a definition of what an article is, but certainly if we can dig into that data and bring it up, then that would be great. But right now, because it's title level content for most things, I think the overlap isn't there, because as far as I know, JATS doesn't do a lot of journal level description. But is there?
There is rich journal level metadata. It depends on what the publisher chooses to do. In our new platform, actually, we're building K Bart support.
Great.
But it's a combination of the content and our access control system, right? Because that's where all the licenses live.
Right.
And so on. So you need both systems to get this, which leads me to my question for you. You mentioned open access metadata. What happens when it's not the same for the entire journal?
Right. So, and actually that's part of what I was thinking of here, because one of the biggest challenges for K Bart at the journal level is that we have hybrid OA models that are really taking off. It's very common to have articles in the same issue, some be open access and others not be. Through the development, we basically decided to go with open access, fee-based, or hybrid. I don't know what libraries will do with hybrid, but it will at least indicate that that period of time has that additional access, and they might choose to figure out how to use it.
The relevant other standard initiative for this is license ref.
Okay.
Cross-ref, because cross-ref is going to enable the deposit of an article level licensing metadata into the cross-ref system.
Got it. And I think that's another thing about lists, is ideally we're really moving to the article level, which is another reason why the lists aren't necessarily not necessarily applicable. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do we have time?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi, Bert Corelli, Highlight Press.
Mm-hmm.
Back to K Bart.
Yep.
Still getting requests to support MARC records, and I'm just wondering, you see K Bart supplanting that need?
Right. So I'll say no and yes. No, because the provision of the MARC records are about description, and we're entirely about access at K Bart. At least we try to be. We really try to have it be just the content that's necessary to get access to the content. The flip side of that, though, as I mentioned, is that if a K Bart formatted file describes a library's access, then that could drive which MARC records are delivered to the library, but ultimately there still has to be a provider of those MARC records, because things like subjects, et cetera, are not being addressed by K Bart at all.
Probably more. Very much.
Go ahead.
How does the DDA approach fit together with budgets and libraries, so budgets for resources?
Yeah, so budgets, DDA and budgets in libraries. So ultimately, the way I think it usually works, libraries have a monograph budget. They are transitioning from all print in their monograph budget to adding electronic books into their monograph budget. As they do that, many libraries would prefer to only buy ebooks that they know their users want, and they have that option, whereas they did not have that in the print world. So what libraries like to do is say, well, for this subject area, I want to switch into this percentage of electronic books. For this other subject area, I want to switch to this percentage. And another subject area, I want to switch to a smaller percentage. You might imagine science is high, arts and humanities low, that sort of a thing. Then ideally, we would be able to enable them to say, well, if I want to spend 20% of my monograph budget on demand-driven acquisition, what's the relative range of records I might be able to provide my users so that the numbers work out as well as possible. So right now, the unpredictability at the individual library level makes it hard, and that actually is a great question because we'd love to enable libraries to have enough predictability that they really feel comfortable doing this, because we feel like it makes a lot of sense to take this approach, but that challenge of, uh-oh, I don't know how much I'm going to spend, or if I set a budget and it's gone after, 1/3 a year, then what do I do? That's one of the major challenges we're trying to address.
So I think one last question. The guy behind Bill.
Go ahead. Sorry. Yes.
This is the first time I've ever heard of K Bart.
Okay.
So, some very basic questions. One is, you said that it supports the journal and book mark record delivery.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, to where?
Right.
And then secondly, does it support mark records at the chapter level as well as the title?
Okay, so I'll answer the second question first because it's easier. We have not done any chapter level work. It's really for journals. We're looking at the title level, and for books, we are also looking only at full monographs, not including at this time chapters. In terms of supporting that delivery, the way it supports the delivery is if a library has accurate lists of their holdings in their knowledge base, often their MARC records are delivered from their knowledge base provider based on that list. So which MARC records my library has is entirely dependent on what's in my knowledge base. And so we can't manage both separately. And it's the same thing with managing ebooks in library catalogs as well as elsewhere. That's really too challenging. So if this is done right, it can feed that into the library. So it's the central data source for both kinds of information. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason.